Hey, how's it going, everybody, and welcome back into the SFS channel for some Week 16 lineup advice here. Last week, we learned the hard way that sometimes putting these videos out earlier on in the week can be potentially problematic with the availability of players changing very rapidly with the spiked number of COVID cases in the league right now. But if you watched yesterday's episode, you will be aware and know that I will not be with my recording studio here for the next 2 days. So this is really the only time I'm able to get this video out for you all. So here I've got 5 guys who are currently healthy today that I have as must-start running backs for the fantasy football semifinals here. It's a big week. Last week was a really odd slate of games. Basically, a large portion of the important and key players that got us to the fantasy playoffs laid some eggs. It was low-scoring games. A lot of weird stuff happened. And whatever you expected to be the case really didn't play out. Unless you were a Jonathan Taylor owner or a Travis Kelce owner, those were two of like the big-name fantasy studs that actually delivered for us and had big-time lineup value. But again, it was a fairly quiet week, a lot of low-scoring numbers across generally all of my leagues last week. I think that, just in general, the NFL had some lower-scoring games, less offensive output and productivity. So it was an odd time to play fantasy, but that's what happens here down the stretch. Everything gets a little bit more interesting, more competitive, and that's what we're at here. So one more time, 5 must-start running backs. Hopefully these players can stay healthy this week. Last week, I believe it was my wide receivers episode. Just hours after I posted, 3 of them had gone out with COVID and then didn't end up suiting up for the games on this past Sunday afternoon. So hoping that this can go a little bit better and that these players will be available for you all. So let's hit the intro, let's see, and let's get started. All right, here we go, kicking this thing off and getting started again for Week 16 action here. Ronald Jones is the first name up on the list, and this time around, this has less to do with matchup and more to do with situation for Rojo in this Tampa Bay offense. I referenced this tweet in yesterday's episode for waiver wire ads. Rojo is my priority pickup for this week, so obviously those claims have already processed, and there is a darn good chance that he is rostered in your league at this point in time. But if that is for some reason not the case, you need to go snatch him up right now. For the next 1 or 2 games here, while Leonard Fournette is out of the lineup, Ronald Jones is absolutely a top 12 caliber fantasy running back, or someone at least that has the potential to crack into those numbers, especially next week if he's able to get that starting job and Leonard Fournette's not able to go against the New York Jets. But here in Week 16, he's got the Carolina Panthers. Just to read off, I referenced this tweet yesterday as well. In Ronald Jones's last 4 performances with Leonard Fournette missing games, this was in the 2020 season, so nothing in 2021 here, but still in the recent past with it being last season, Rojo had 4 games without Leonard Fournette in the lineup where he went 26 touches for $128, 20 touches for $125, 25 touches for $121 and 2 touchdowns, and 19 touches for 84 yards and another rushing touchdown. So 3 TDs across those 4 games, 3 games of 120 plus rushing yards, and another game in which Leonard Fournette played 29 snaps and had 198 yards rushing against the Carolina Panthers, who Rojo happens to be playing this week. So no Leonard Fournette. He's been catching a very nice volume of passes as of late, and Giovanni Bernard's on the injured reserve. That leaves really just Ronald Jones, who has had a tough season. It's not been one to remember for Ronald Jones. He had some fumble issues early and kind of got booted out of the rotation there, and Giovanni Bernard has been kind of the passing downs back, and Leonard Fournette has been kind of the do-it-all player who's also been seeing a ton of volume in the passing game as of late. So if Ronald Jones can even absorb, I said this I think yesterday as well, half of the receiving volume, because he's not an overly great pass-catching back. He's not someone who is super proficient and dynamic in that phase of the game, but if he can get half of the work that Leonard Fournette was getting in that area of things, I think this, again, has easily top 12 potential written all over it. I'll go Javonte Williams here for our second player taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, the 29th ranked unit against the fantasy running back. In 3 of his last 4 games, Javonte Williams has 17.5 or more fantasy points in half PPR scoring. That's very, very productive numbers. Just 9 points, still a solid floor this past game on 15 carries for 72 yards in a 10-15 loss against the Cincinnati Bengals. That game was a low-scoring defensive struggle fest for the entire 4 quarters of that game. One key note here is that Teddy Bridgewater was actually carted off the field in that game. I'm very, very doubtful of his availability for this coming week's matchup, which most likely means that Drew Lock is going to be in position to start for this Broncos team. To me, what that means is that this is a quarterback who is not exactly someone that has the best intangibles and someone that has the best mental side. He's not the most cerebral quarterback. Drew Lock's a little bit more of a free, loose player, makes some poor decisions with the football, and plays a little bit reckless. So I think that to counteract that, the Broncos are going to implement a very heavy rushing attack here. I think that Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon both have very strong and quality RB2 potential in this game. Another thing about last week, Javonte had 4 receptions on all 4 of his targets. Only 9 yards, though, in the receiving game. Worth noting, though, that he is being deployed in that fashion. So, again, great matchup with the 29th ranked Las Vegas Raiders defense against the run. And the fact that you get a quarterback who I think that this team is really going to try and baby and make sure that he doesn't have the chance to lose them this football game with making costly errors, because that's been something that has resulted in Teddy Bridgewater being the quarterback for this team. Drew Lock, obviously a former second-round pick back in 2019, I want to say, for Denver, has a lot of arm talent, has a cannon, he can throw the ball deep, he's got talent, but there's a little bit of Jay Cutler-esque similarities. Not only do they kind of look similar, but they are also strong arm quarterbacks, that don't always make the best choices. So lots of Javonte Williams, lots of Melvin Gordon. I'm expecting, again, a heavy ground and pound attack. David Montgomery, this is one we've been liking a lot as of late here. He hasn't been able to capitalize on ceiling numbers all that much as of late, but the floor has still been respectable enough to not feel awful about. Montgomery, though, playing this week against the 31st ranked Seattle Seahawks rushing defense. Every single week, it seems like whoever's playing the Seahawks, I love on paper. And Montgomery's got all the talent, all the intangibles to be a very effective player here. And Chicago's passing offense has been so terrible that they really just, quite frankly, need to rely on the run game to have any substance of an offense here. So they are going to be dependent on David Montgomery. They're going to need to keep this game tight. Otherwise, Russell Wilson is going to storm back into this and potentially whoop them all over the football field here. David Montgomery is a dynamic 3-down back. They just have to get him enough touches. Matt Nagy seems like he can't run an offense. I mean, they weren't even able to knock off primetime Kirk Cousins the other night, despite Kirk not really playing his best game. At one point, he had 74 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and then he had that interception that he just lobbed up into the middle of the field. So the Bears are kind of a mess right now. We're betting on the matchup here and the talent of the halfback that is David Montgomery. Again, Montgomery does have the potential to be a great player. 2 weeks ago against Arizona, a tougher opponent who the Bears weren't able to maintain relative competitiveness with. He did have 21 rushing attempts for 90 yards and a rushing touchdown on top of 8 catches for 50 yards. So we have flashes and we have short stints of great fantasy production. I think that's something that is possible this week given the matchup. It's just a matter of actually executing and getting him the football enough times to be successful, and in most cases having the Bears be within 1 score of the opposing team. Cordarrelle Patterson coming off of his worst output of this fantasy season against the Detroit Lions. I am still going to trust him and deploy him out in my lineup this week against the 30th ranked Detroit Lions rush defense against fantasy football running backs. Cordarrelle Patterson at the end of the day is too dynamic. He is too versatile of an offensive weapon to not be factored more into this offense. And it was such a one-sided contest last week against San Francisco that ultimately Cordarrelle was just kind of shut down. His largest output of yardage in an individual play was 4 yards against San Francisco, and he didn't even top 20 yards rushing. So obviously a terrible performance. Again, only 2 fantasy points in half PPR, scoring his lowest output of, again, the entire 2021 season. He does have one other stinker with 3.5 fantasy points, but this is very uncharacteristic for a player who's had an excellent 1,000-plus yard from scrimmage season. Patterson, again, too dynamic. The Falcons need him too much as an offensive playmaker, whether it's in the receiving game or in the rushing department, to not get him the football. I think there's a great opportunity for Patterson to be used well as both a rusher and a receiver, split out wide and in the backfield in this matchup against the tough and physical Lions defense. And then finally here, James Robinson, what a resurgence he had. Who would have thought? You get Urban Meyer out the door, and look what this guy can do. I mean, the first 2 weeks of the season, it was evident that they were not getting James Robinson the football enough. And then lately, they stopped giving him the ball as much as they had been in the middle chunk of the year when they were playing much better offensive football. Now it was still leaving a lot to be desired on the table and whatnot. Turnovers and Trevor Lawrence's touchdown to interception ratio is pretty porous. But James Robinson has come back here after Urban Meyer had that little streak of pretty much benching him. He only had, I believe, 6 carries for 4 yards just a couple weeks back in a matchup where he should have been very productive. And you get Urban Meyer out the door. He comes out, 18 rushing attempts, 75 yards and a touchdown, 3 grabs through the air for 13 yards. This is a player who is probably the most reliable offensive piece that this Jaguars team has, and going up against the dead last 32nd ranked New York Jets rushing defense, he should have himself a field day here. There's absolutely the chance that J-Rob comes out and gives, fantasy teams the spark they're looking for at that RB2 position, hopefully in your lineups. I think he can give you a lot on the ground and, a little bit of serviceability there in the passing game as well. If J-Rob can find the end zone too, that makes it all the better. I think he'll have an efficient day rushing on the ground. And again, with no more Urban Meyer, no more limited touches, no more pitch counts, he'll get the full workload. It seems like Darrell Bevell is not going to, he even said it in the first couple of days of him being named interim coach, that James Robinson is the starting running back for this team, and they're going to use him as such going forward. So a good game last week against Houston. James Robinson, another must-start player for me here in Week 16. Alrighty, those were my 5 must-start running backs here again for Week 16 fantasy football action. If you have questions about the running back positions in your fantasy lineups this week, make sure to drop those down in the comment section below, and I'll get back to as many of you as possible. And remember, with my limited recording schedule this week, please join up that SFS community Discord so you can interact with myself and other members of the community and make sure you're ready to go for these big, crucial Week 16 games. So with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in. Go check out my 5 must-start wide receivers episode, which also dropped this morning, and I'll see you guys there. Peace out.